it kind of slays me a little bit to say this, but I think I wanted to be told that I had a chemical imbalance. Like, I think I viewed it as an easy explanation, and I very much wanted an easy explanation, like something that just made everything make sense and I could just do one thing and it would be all better. And you know, I think it gave me that in the beginning was, here's this label, here's this pill, and, you know, maybe there's nothing that, you need to work on so much. Like maybe it's just all take this pill. And I think I wanted it to be that easy when I was that age.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph, and I'm really glad to be joined by Trudy again, who's like a regular now on the channel. And today we're going to be talking about, I guess, what Peter Bregan used to call medication spellbinding, but maybe it's like, when he would use it, he'd talk about you'd be on the medication and you wouldn't realize that it might be making you worse. But we're going to take it a step further to talk about not just that part of it, but also kind of waking up from, what oftentimes is like the medicalization of your mental illness. When you kind of almost get lulled into thinking that you have some permanent psychiatric condition where, maybe the problems that you had were, contextual, environmental, maladaptive, traits that you had that weren't serving you in your life and such, and then, things better addressed by means other than medication. And so before I forget, right at the start of this video, I'm going to say in the comments below, if you could just comment on like what was the moment that made you wake up and change that trajectory, because many people end up on the meds for a long time, like maybe a decade before they go, actually, you know what, this isn't helping me. So in the comments below, I want to hear from you. What was the one thing or the many things that helped you kind of wake up to it? Okay, but and so moving on from that, Trudy, turning it over to you. I posed this question to you last time we were talking, and then we were just like, oh my God, we should make this a video. And I know you've been kind of thinking about it, but I'll let you kind of dive in. Maybe just like walk us through your awakening and how that sort of happened.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to be back with you here today and having another conversation. I find these tremendous food for thought, and I hope that others find them as helpful and enlightening as I do. So yeah, my own awakening, it's an interesting question. And I mentioned to you right before we went live that I've been mulling it over for weeks. And I don't have a magic instant moment. I guess you could call it a whole bunch of baby steps where the things that I believed were true, reality kind of slapped me across the face and made me go, oh, maybe this isn't true. Um,
I'm thinking about maybe a better way to do this, if I may interrupt. Maybe take us back to the beginning and tell us like, how did you end up thinking that you had, did you have a bipolar diagnosis? Was that the one? Yeah. What was that process like of having the problems and then getting the label and then kind of getting like caught up in this, oh, I have bipolar disorder and I need these medications. That might be an interesting place to kind of start.
yeah, it actually is because I think you could fairly say I almost created an identity for myself around that. I have bipolar. I need these meds. I can't help this. This is just the way I am. And I was a huge advocate for like, never miss a dose, always stay on your meds because, they teach you that bipolar patients historically go off and on, and that's just the nature of the illness because of denial. And so I was like, no, I'm not going to make the mistakes everybody else makes. I'm just going to be this perfect little patient. Um, and so that was kind of the story that I built for myself, thinking that if I just did what I was told, my life would go back to, the quote unquote normal. And that would be at the end of the story. Like I'd just be someone living with bipolar and that would be it. It was kind of a simplistic view, and reality didn't pan out that way.
And when did you, like, how old were you when you first started taking medications? Like, when was that first interaction with the psychiatric system?
So I was 19 when I was first referred to a psychiatrist. I had been trialed on Prozac and Deserol, trazodone,
Yeah.
when I was 17, and that was just through a pediatrician. And the Prozac I reacted quite badly to. Um, and so but it was kind of 2 years later, when there was a lot of trauma stuff going on, that kind of shuffled me fully into the psychiatric system.
And I guess when you were 17, I know this is so long ago, and you first started taking Prozac, like, how was it sold to you? Like, did they give you any greater context? Was it like, hey, this is just something that's going to like get you through this, and we're going to be doing therapy at the same time, and like you're not going to be on this forever? Or was it like, you have depression, Trudy, like, but don't worry, we have this great medication that treats major depressive disorder? Do you remember how it was packaged? Or maybe, I mean, you're 17, for God's sakes. Maybe you just took it because, you went to the pediatrician and they were just like, and you're like, well, you do what the doctor says, they know more. Like, what do you recall about that first kind of introduction?
It was given to me as here's a solution for where you're struggling. Um, and so I just thought it was going to solve the things I was struggling with. Like I was dealing with some pretty heavy, situational based issues, I guess you could say, from trauma. And I believed, like, oh, I'll take this pill and everything will feel fine. I won't feel upset anymore. And I was in therapy at the time, like both individual therapy and group therapy, but it was really just here's this drug, it's pretty new, we think it's going to fix everything. And I was like, okay. Like I really didn't think critically about it because I came through school in the 80s and early 90s, which was kind of really when all of the SSRIs and everything were becoming more known, and it was starting to become maybe not socially acceptable, but there was small groups where, you could read in encyclopedias. I'm aging myself, but there was material that you could read about depression and about all these different things. And so I was very much of the belief of, oh, I must have a chemical imbalance and I'll just take this pill and everything will be better.
And that whole idea of like, when when you were 17, like, how did you even conceptualize your problems? Was it like, my life, there's problems in my life, it's stressful, there's bad things happening? Like, was that your understanding, or was it like maybe kind of too up in the air to really know? You just like, I just feel terrible and I'm sad. And then, because I guess the reason I'm asking you this is because once you start taking a medication, I feel like implicitly it kind of shifts into a more of a chemical imbalance type of narrative. And so I wanted to know kind of how you thought about your problems, before the medications came into the scene.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I had some self awareness that there were certain times of the year that I had an easier time just coping with life. And then there were times of the year where it was really hard. So I always kind of had a seasonal pattern when I was, probably a teenager, like mid teens. So I was aware of that, but it never really interfered heavily with anything. It
Hmm.
wasn't until I was really doing trauma work that it was just I'm not actually even sure if it was that it was too much for me versus it being too much for the people around me. Because when I kind of look back in hindsight and I say, well, was I okay? And I think I fundamentally was okay, but it's difficult, for a lot of people, I think. But I know for the people that were around me, they struggled seeing my emotional suffering. So they and I wasn't able, I didn't have the skills to not show it, I guess. So I think I believed that there was in hindsight, I think I believed I had more of a problem than what I truly did, rather than being like, anybody who's been through a situation like this is going to be dealing with a high intensity of emotions and, maybe build a toolbox rather than throwing a prescription at them. But that was what I was given, was take a pill.
It's interesting that the I guess the perception of whether you're having a problem, it can sometimes be like contextual. It's like when it becomes a problem for the people around you as well. And I know, depending on the anxieties of your parents and things like that, like sometimes, yeah, of course. I mean, not sometimes. I mean, it's clear, seeing someone that you love in distress and is like, having problems, and maybe it's interfering with school, and, they're more reclusive and things like that, that worries people. And they go, well, I don't want my daughter to get left behind. I don't want her to have problems. So let me take her to the pediatrician. I trust doctors. I know they're the experts, and they'll tell me what to do. They'll let me know how to help her, And so that's like a common story that I hear, where it's like it gets started by the loved ones. Yeah, I guess who are, maybe even more worried than the person suffering, and wanting to help.
Yeah, I think, it was the family I was living with was who got me into therapy. And I did need therapy. Like, there's no denying that. I was dealing with some pretty serious stuff, but I don't think, you know, like, it's interesting what hindsight does, right? Because especially because you've had time to grow and mature, and at 17 you just don't have that same distress tolerance that you do as an adult, right? Like, little things seem huge, and earth shattering, and you don't have the same, I guess, context of the variations of just the landscape of emotions, if you will.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe at the start, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's okay. So the family that you're living with, they're worried about you, and you go, well, if they're worried about me, this is, guess, clinically significant, or this goes beyond the bounds of what's normal, and now I have this medication. I mean, is that the point that you start feeling like you have a chemical imbalance, or does it happen over time? What's that journey from kind of being there to, you know, g- you know, going forward?
So I think, and it kind of slays me a little bit to say this, but I think I wanted to be told that I had a chemical imbalance. Like, I think I viewed it as an easy explanation, and I very much wanted an easy explanation, like something that just made everything make sense, and I could just do one thing and it would be all better. And you know, I think it gave me that in the beginning, was, here's this label, here's this pill, and, you know, maybe there's nothing that, you need to work on so much. Like, maybe it's just all take this pill. And I think I wanted it to be that easy, when I was that age.
Yeah. Okay. And so moving forward from there, because I imagine you stay in that state for quite some time. I mean, it's sort of in your late teens. When did the awakening start?
That would probably have happened after my last hospitalization. I would say is probably kind of the initial, where it was like, okay, going back into hospital isn't going to solve anything, and adding more medication isn't going to solve anything. And that would have been, I feel like, 2001.
And so
Um,
how old are you at that stage?
20, born in 76, so 25.
25. Okay. So there's like a good like 8 years or something, kind of in there. And then so you're 25, and just to recap me, and maybe also the audience, so it sounds like you had you had repeat hospitalizations and just more and more meds getting added, that not really working, and then there's this moment, when you just go, they're not going to help me, and
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a period of about 5 years. My first hospitalization was in September of 2019, not 2019, I was 19. So what year was that? 90, I didn't think about this ahead of time. I graduated in 94, so 95, 96. I think it was September 96 was when my first hospitalization was. And I was in for 6 weeks. Came out on like everything you can imagine. Um, and then I think I was out for 2 to 4 weeks, and then I was back in right away again. And it kind of started this revolving door of where I'd go in and I'd feel better by the time I was getting out, and I'd get discharged. And then, depending on the time period, it would be weeks to months before I'd be back in hospital again. And I added it up once, and over the course of the 5 years, I spent over 2 years as an inpatient if you add up all of the separate hospitalizations. And it was, that was kind of the landscape. Was I had just gotten out of hospital, and I'd had, I want to say, a 6 week hospitalization, and then I had the previous hospitalization before that had been 3 months or something like that, and I'd only been
Wow.
out for maybe 4 weeks in between them. And I think I'd been home again for maybe a week or two when I was feeling suicidal again. And I got mad. Like, I legitimately felt mad because I felt like, clearly this revolving door of hospitalization isn't doing anything. Clearly, meds isn't doing anything. So, what's the answer? And that was the moment where I made some pretty fundamental changes in terms of, like, I got off of benzos and the sleeping pills and the antipsychotics at that point, um, and started exercising, like just going for daily walks. And that was the last, like, I was never back in hospital after that. So it was a fundamental shift in kind of how I viewed, um, I guess, the diagnosis. I no longer believed the hospital or my doctor had the answer, but I still believed that there was something wrong with me, if that makes sense. So it was like I got rid of all the extra things and I just kept the bare bones of what I believed I needed, and then just kind of carried on that way for a whole bunch more years, until like 2017. Um,
And so that time, were you just on, because I know you were on Lamictal at that time, but remind me again, what was the other medication that you were tapering with Lamictal?
so Buspar, I tapered
Okay.
at the same time as Lamictal, and I had been on Strattera as well.
Okay.
And I guess, the last prescription I think I had for a benzo was in 2009. So the doctor that I had was still sometimes giving me PRN stuff. But by the time I left her, the next doctor didn't give me anything new. Like, it was
Okay.
just never even suggested.
So
Uh,
you so you were in this like cycle of spending like a lot of time in the psychiatric hospital, and then you stop antipsychotics and benzodiazepines and you never go back.
yeah,
I mean, do you think those medications, there was something about those that were particularly destabilizing to your mood and they were maybe making you more suicidal? I mean, is that why like how do you
yeah, I don't
understand like
know.
going like why you'd feel better after 3 months and then a couple months or something later you're back in like it just like that
Yeah, that's
instability.
a super interesting question because, and this kind of ties right into our conversation. Like, I never thought to blame the medication, but could the medication have been contributing to it? Absolutely. Like, but that is not part of the story I've told myself. So that's a very interesting thought, because the story I've told myself is that I just developed better coping skills. And once I made that decision that the hospital didn't have the answer and I just took it away as an option, that I moved through life differently. But there was a whole bunch of other changes at the same time. Like there was the loss of a whole bunch of medications. So it absolutely could have been connected to that, and I just never thought of it.
I mean, I don't want to diminish how powerful it is when they call it like the locus of control, right? Up until that
Yes.
point, it's like the hospital has the answer, the experts have the answer, the doctors have the answer, and then bringing that inside, how empowering that could be. I mean, so I'm sure that played a big role in it also. Um, but okay, you're mostly on Strattera, Buspar, and Strattera for those remaining years, and you're out of the hospital. What and you're like, but there's still something wrong with me, and I guess that's the rationalization to keep on taking those medications. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What was the next shift that got you to the point where you were just like, I'm coming off everything?
Um, well, the next shift would have been I knew that I guess it probably would have been a generic substitute of one of the meds that I was on. And like for the bus par, I only one generic brand worked for me. Going on to any of the other generics, it was like I was just stopped. And so the brand I'd been on had a shortage. The pharmacy swapped me to a different brand. I didn't think anything of it. And then 3 days later, I felt like I was losing my mind. And I'm like massively panicked of like, how can I cope with life with how I'm feeling right now? Managed to find the right generic brand at a different pharmacy, and everything went back to normal. And that scared me because I didn't want a medication to have that kind of power over me. Like when you're going through your life and you feel like, everything is pretty good, and then you discover that just a change in brand can feel like the rug is being pulled out from under you. It's a feeling of powerlessness, like you feel subject to things that are completely beyond your control. And so that was kind of, it planted a seed, I guess you could say, of if there's ever an opportunity to get off of this, I want to. And then I had the cold turkey stop of the Strattera that put me into horrible withdrawal and didn't have the option to go back on to anything else. And that was the point where I kind of started looking for other options, other solutions, like, okay, what's going on? What can I do differently? And I knew I knew that more meds weren't an option. Like I was not willing to go back onto the roller coaster of trying different meds. I just inherently knew that the most unstable time of my life was the time when I'd be on a medication and things would get worse. And so they'd rip me off the medication and put me on something else. And like, I didn't want to go back to that kind of circle, like this continuous cycle. I just wasn't willing to go back.
Did you have like a moment where you stumbled upon like, I don't know, Robert Whitaker or like Peter Bregan or something like that? Or was all of this like just welling up from inside of you, just like, this isn't working? Because I know some people, it comes across their lap and they're just like, oh my God, looking back at everything, I think, the medications were a part of it. I mean, did you have the Robert Whitaker moment, or anything like that?
So I kind of did. When I was in withdrawal, I found a program online that was someone who was, change your diet, change your life sort of thing. And that was like, oh, like that's a thing. Like it kind of put ideas into my head. And then as I kind of, I guess, looked a little further into it, I read Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Was this
And
when you were just on Strattera, Buspar, and lamotrigine, or was this like
I
kind
was
of
off the
before?
Strattera,
Okay,
and I was still on the Lamictal Buspar. So it
okay.
was before I started getting off of the Lamictal Buspar, but I was at that point, I was, coming off Strattera was such a profound experience. One of the things I described was it was like I'd been living life with a gauzy curtain in front of me, and I had no idea. Like, it was like I didn't have the same sense of the world, of the people around me. Like, I just, if you can imagine literally just having something put in front of you and you're living life and you think that's the real world, and then that curtain disappears and you're like, holy cow, like, this is incredible. And I had no idea that I had lost this. And that moment was a very powerful moment for me, because it made me go, like, I don't want to have a veil between myself and the world. I want to feel it. I want to connect with it. I want to interact with it. And so, I really enjoyed Robert Whitaker's book, reading about it. Like, it changed my beliefs fundamentally, because prior to that book, I thought that it was settled science, which sounds funny to say, but I thought that the serotonin theory of depression was factual, proven, that it was like indisputable. I had no idea that it was really still a theory and there was evidence to call the whole thing into question. Um, so that really, I think, turned my world upside down in a good way, because I lost that belief of everything is just a chemical imbalance and you just have to match up the right pill for the right imbalance. I realized at that point it was like I'd been kind of sold snake oil, was kind of the feeling that I had.
So how did you understand, I guess, your problems after coming out the other side of that book? I mean, so it takes this idea that you have and just tears it to shreds, and then like what do you do with that? When you've been essentially taking medications for supposedly like a well, I don't know. Yeah, you tell me. Like what? Like were you just like there's still something wrong with me? It's just not a chemical imbalance, or like where were you after that?
I think I felt like, okay, so clearly it can't be a chemical imbalance. There's too much evidence to the contrary. And that was, I think, when I started looking at it through the context of, coping skills and maturity, like, my own personal maturity. I'm not saying anything about where anyone else is, but I was, when I started down the medication path, I was not mature. I was very emotionally immature. And I had a lot of things. I was naive, and I wasn't the same person that I am now. And so I think I look at it in a lot of ways as it could have been any belief. It could have been a cult. It could have been anything that captured me and made me think, like, this is the answer to all of my problems. And if I do something different, everything is going to get better. Um, it just happened to be that it was psych meds that was where I got caught.
Yeah. And so I'll say it again. How did you, I mean, how did you understand like so going back like at that point were you just like maybe I don't have bipolar disorder? Maybe I was someone struggling with emotional immaturity, like looking back on it, and I still had a
Yeah.
lot of developing of coping skills. Was that kind of where you landed at that point?
I'm not sure if it was exactly that point or if it was after I had read, because Dr. Bregan has a book, Peter Bregan, about discontinuing psychiatric medication. I don't remember the exact title of the book.
Yeah, yep.
Um, but after I'd read that book, and I believe it was his book where he spells out like four main paths that people who are polydrugged follow. And when I saw myself in one of the paths that he'd spelled out, I was like, holy crap. Like, how many of my problems were not me, but were caused by the medications that I was put on. And that was when I really started to kind of consider that perhaps a bulk of my symptoms weren't me, but were actually the drugs. And I do think in hindsight that I coped less well because I was medicated. Um, like I know my brain didn't develop normally when I was in my young teen or young adulthood, when you would normally be developing executive functioning and all of those things. Like I developed that after I came off of Lamictal. Uh, and so I know that the medications froze my brain, for lack of a better way to put it. And I didn't start to develop these extra things until after the medications were cleared out.
I mean, in the community, we might talk more about this, but it's not anything that was ever brought up in any of my psychiatric training or any of anything that I read in mainstream textbooks. But it's the idea that psychiatric medications may actually hinder the kind of the emotional growth of a person, or the I guess also the cognitive growth as well. Really, the only way they're described as, oh, these things can facilitate, better therapy by like maybe, making you more open to it, or, less anxious, that you can access some realizations. That's the main way they're kind of described as like facilitating healing in people. But really what you're talking about, and really what I think about deeply these days, is how being in a state of I guess diminished, um, I don't know whether it's attunement or receptiveness to sensory material, like relational stuff that's coming in, and how you respond to people and the world around you and stuff like that, about how significant that is. I mean, I've got my own thoughts about it, but I want to, like, what are your reflections on that, on what being on medications, like, I guess maybe during that period of your time, what it does in terms of the I guess the emotional and cognitive development of someone.
I think it is paralyzing, like fundamentally more paralyzing than is really talked about. And I say that in part because when I was tapering Lamictal, I went through a period where it was like I was thinking way more. It was like, I don't know, maybe my brain was waking up. I don't know. Um, and I was terrified that I was not going to keep the ability to think about what was going on around me. Like, um, I guess it's been long enough now that I can say that at this point, I do take for granted the ability to, listen to a question someone's asked and kind of reflect on it and then give an answer. But when I was medicated, I didn't have that ability. Like that reflection piece, I was largely incapable of in the same way. Now, I would have thought that I was. 100% I would have thought that I was. But one of the things that I realized while I was tapering was the frequency that I was missing important conversational cues. So my oldest daughter was still at home at the time, and she preferred to like have mother-daughter talks later in the evening, and I'd frequently be gaming at the time when she was initiating conversations. So I would miss the cue of, this is important to her. She's not just saying, oh yeah, I did such and such today, and it's, fluffy talk. That she's actually coming to me with a situation that's important and she wants my input. And I was completely missing those cues, like just not picking them up whatsoever. And then as I was tapering, I suddenly started picking them up.
Oh my
And it
God.
was this,
Wow.
and it was this almost horrifying realization that I'd been going through life believing that I'd been paying attention to the people around me and interacting with them fully, but had not been able to pick up on the cues that we all give in our day-to-day conversations. And I think that was, that's one moment that sticks out in my head of like how numbing was the medication. While it was so numbing that I couldn't tell the difference between, yeah, I went to school and the bus was 5 minutes late versus my friend is dealing with this really serious problem and should I call the distress line? Like, obviously, those are two drastically different buckets in terms of the level of attention that one would give. And I couldn't differentiate.
And can you tell, you know, I'm sorry, I'm gonna ask some background because I don't know. Are you married?
Yeah,
Okay, and when did you meet? When did you and your husband get together? How old were you?
young.
Okay.
So we actually met on a BBS when I
So what
was
is that?
14.
Yeah.
So that's like before the internet. BBS stands for Bulletin Board Service, and you literally had a modem that you punched in a phone number on your computer and it dialed another computer, and you basically accessed that other computer's hard drive, and then you'd hang up and someone else would dial the same number and they would access the computer's hard drive and you could leave messages that way. And that was how I met my husband, just as friends. Like, I was having troubles at home and he, gave me support, and we were just friends for years. And then we decided to be college roommates. Um, and I'd read that, males and females made better college roommates. And so we moved in together, completely platonic when we moved in together. And then we fell in love and we got married in the June after that. So I was 18 when we got married, which like was before all the psych med stuff.
Can you tell me how do you see, like, what was the relationship like when you were on the medications to when you came off? Because you talked about this, like, I guess, attunement to your daughter. Obviously, that's an extremely strong relationship, the maternal one, like that. But the other main relationship is the one, with your spouse. When you look back on your kind of awakening and before and after in your relationship, what did you notice changed?
It's a really hard question because my husband is still on some medication. He's on antidepressants, and he's in the process of tapering them at the moment. But I think, the simplistic answer is that I craved a deeper connection, like a
Afterwards?
true, yeah.
Yeah.
And the things that I previously didn't care about, like if he was on the computer all the time or, that kind of thing. Um, those things are, they seem barriers to me now, whereas they didn't before. And it's an exercise in patience, because I know how disconnected I was. And so I see some of that disconnect in him, if that makes sense. So I think it complicates things a little bit because he's on medication still.
That's interesting that it almost added a complication to your relationship for you to wake up. So it's like improved your relationship with your daughter and your children, I suspect. Was it, and I mean, a lot of people are going to find themselves in this position as well because it's not uncommon that both spouses are medicated and going through similar things. That's a very common situation. How did he respond to your awakening and to you reading Anatomy of an Epidemic and Peter Bregan stuff and kind of going through that journey when he was on medications? What was that like?
So my husband is a really laid back guy, and things just really don't ruffle his feathers. Um, and he's used to me being hyper informed on topics, would maybe be a kind way to
Yeah.
put it.
She's just like
Um,
Trudy's just on one of her things again. Yeah.
yeah, like, oh,
Yeah.
she's found something new to read about, and it's somewhat interesting, but don't know if it applies to me. And I think he also, he watched what I went through with withdrawal. And so once I was kind of through all of my own stuff, we've had some conversations, and he has a lot of fear around the withdrawal process. because he's seen what I went through. Um, and so he's not sure if he can make it through the same kind of process that what I went through. And so he's only recently actually made his first decrease. And I wasn't even sure if he was going to, honestly, because I said to him, like, if this is something you want to do, I'll support you, but you need to do some research for yourself. You need to decide this is right for yourself. Like, I don't want this to be something you do because you think it's what I want you to do. Like, this needs to be for yourself.
Wow. Okay. I guess, I mean, I'm stumped. I thought I had a question, but I don't. Yeah. Yeah.
it's it's interesting, I think, when you've got like, for me, I see a lot of my own old avoidant behaviors, like when I was really checked out. Um, and I see some of those things. And it's hard to see someone else kind of struggling with things that you realize was something that you did and caused difficulties for other people around you when you were doing it, if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense to me. I mean that realization you had with your daughter must have felt like a dagger to the heart, because like how long was that
Yeah,
going on for? I mean, I cannot imagine like having the
yeah,
realization and the pain, with something like that.
yeah, absolutely. It was, what conversations have I missed? What conversations have I not been fully present for because I didn't realize I needed to be present? Um, and there was a period in my taper where I really questioned, like, is me dealing with withdrawal having a negative effect on my kids? Is it impacting my ability to be a loving mom and to be present and do the things that I want to do for them? And I had a friend, at the time who said, sometimes you need to do things for yourself in order to better take care of others. And my kids now, I can say quite confidently they've benefited, in the end, in spades, because I do things now that I never would have done before. My son and I go out into the mountains and we do backpacking trips. And,
Mhm.
I'm in summer band with my middle daughter right now. And like, we're playing flute together. And, those are things I wouldn't have done before. One, I wouldn't have wanted to step outside my comfort zone, and I wouldn't have, in the case of the band, like, the band was hugely outside my comfort zone because I hadn't played since high school. And so I had this huge fear of being like the weakest link. Uh, but, she really wanted to do it together. And so I realized that, that her wanting to do this together was more meaningful than me possibly being the weakest link, that I needed to push myself and show, that sometimes it's good to take risks and to push yourself outside of your comfort zone and, uh, give her this time and this thing that's important to her. And that's not something I would have been able to do before.
And and a question just dawned on me. So I mean, you were clearly having some problems, when you were 17, and things were bad, and the family you were living with was worried about you, and then um, were those same problems waiting for you, when you came off, or were those things that you had kind of managed to work through, despite being on the medications, kind of achieved that level of coping and emotional maturity and such? Like, what was that? What was that like?
I honestly feel like I didn't process a damn thing while I was on meds.
Okay.
Like, I still have, so it's a little bit different in Canada because psychiatrists can also do therapy, in Canada, and
We
I
can, we
haven't.
can do it in the US as well, but no one thinks that's the case, which is a terrible sign. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so like I still have a psychiatrist that I see, and we're dealing with PTSD issues and without medication, obviously.
Hmm.
And I feel now that I'm actually able to process and able to look at things in a way that is productive. Um, and I don't feel like any of the stuff in the, you know, hundreds of appointments that I had while I was medicated. I None of it has done a darn thing. Like it was kind of all just there waiting. And like I did mature, I did grow up and gain life experience and, you know, learn that I could handle tough things without falling apart. But that's even something that, I work on in therapy is the fear around feeling intense feelings. And learning to trust myself that I can handle these feelings and they're not going to make me fall apart. Um, and it's funny because it's something like that's really intensely personal to share. And yet I'm also a believer that it's so important to model that everybody has struggles. Like even when you've got these areas of your life that are positive and feel like they're all exactly where you want them to be or they're going the direction you want them to be, that there can still be other areas that you need to work on. And that doesn't have to be life destroying, it can be constructive and productive. And um, yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And it's kind of everyone. I mean, I can't believe I didn't think of um, the corollary, because I actually have a similar story. It's going to seem kind of weak, but it was actually incredibly impactful on my life. Was I put out a video not so long ago about my experience using caffeine and nicotine, and I was I mean, really strong cup of black coffee in the morning, soda at midday, and probably like 5 or 6 pouches of chewing tobacco a day, and that was kind of where I found myself at a certain point. And I had gotten to this point where at 4 p.m., 5 p.m., I was just so tired. And I was just like, man, I am exhausted. And I had gotten in this pattern because, I'd come out of residency and then I'd gone to the FDA. And the FDA is not a clinical job, it's a research job. So I was learning a new thing from scratch, clinical trial research. And then before the FDA, I was in the pharmaceutical company. So I was doing all of these new things and I just felt like I needed to be on. And, my daughter had just been born, we were moving a lot. There was like a lot going on. So I just kind of crept into this like heavy stimulant usage. And then I, I was going through a lot of early marriage stuff, as well. We'd gotten married, I think, just before I left residency, and we were kind of working out the kinks, each other's families and kind of the roles they were gonna have in our lives and things like that. And like most marriages, I mean, there were fights in there, and there were, pretty tense fights as well, in terms of figuring out like how, our lives and the relationships with our families and such. And so, anyway, about a year ago, probably I stopped drinking caffeine and I stopped the chewing tobacco. And I had just done it because I was really fatigued, and I'd read something about adrenal fatigue and how these stimulants might cause adrenal burnout, and you'd be fatigued. And I go, oh, that makes enough sense for me. I'm just going to stop. I cold turkeyed myself and was essentially just like a potato for probably like 3 weeks. Couldn't do anything, pretended to be a person at work, just watched like Netflix, just checked out of life completely. And I had this kind of awakening afterwards where I started to have a lot more natural energy. I could, it wasn't like this period of like intensity in the morning, where it was just like I'd drink my coffee and I'd just be on for like 4 hours and could do it. And then I would try and keep that going with the sort of the nicotine and the sodas and things like that. And so that went away and I had much more stability. And I go, this is just wonderful. Also, my sleep improved dramatically. I used to have a really hard time getting back to sleep in the middle of the night. And I'm just like, and that's how I thought about it. But it wasn't until about 5 or 6 months down the road that I realized that I was actually a lot more patient with my wife. And previously to that, I had been, I had like a pretty short fuse. And if she was upset about something, I think I would become very defensive and shut down, and we would get in an argument or something like that. And all of a sudden, I realized that I was actually able to listen to her and hear her without, you know, being like, "Oh, this is how I feel." And I looked back at all of these fights that we had had, at the start of our marriage, figuring things out, and it was just like, in a lot of these cases, it was really me, not being able to actually like hear her and kind of having this short fuse. And I cannot tell you how much of a positive impact coming off even something as benign as caffeine and nicotine has had on just being more even keeled, and better able to listen to listen to my wife and work through difficult things, which we still do. And just mind blowing because you think it's benign. You think it's a benign substance and all of that stuff. And I had another video where I talked about, like, I mean, my sleep was so bad at some points I was even taking Xanax as well, PRN and things like that. It was, and if I would travel for work because of the caffeine and all of that, like I would never sleep, and I'd have to take Xanax on those days as well. And it was just like I sleep like a baby now. I mean, it's just crazy, how big of an impact something like that could have. So it's hard to realize, and yeah, and that was the other thing. It took me a really long time to actually realize how global the effect was on all these different areas, not just energy levels and sleep, but the way and there was also this time, like at the end of the day, I would I used to dread having to read to my daughter. I'd sit in her room and I'd be so shot from all of the caffeine and the nicotine, and I'd be coming down and crashing. It just felt like this chore. And then, that completely like changed. I didn't have this like intensity and all of this like kind of rushed feeling within me. And I just like sit down and read like a stupid kid's book, but it's still like fun and like and fine. But it was, I mean, sometimes I still don't like doing it, but it's like a lot easier than it used to be. But it's very interesting. Yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
and I know, like, I stopped drinking coffee as a, I mean, similar thing. I'd read that, for some people it just doesn't agree, and it was like the anxiety that I constantly had. It was like it just
Yeah.
disappeared,
My
and my
wife's
energy went up too.
Yeah. My wife stopped drinking coffee and nothing happened, and she just felt like gypped. So it didn't affect her. It's not like this panacea, but I do think for some people it can have a pretty big impact. Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad there's no way to know what is going to impact
Yeah.
someone and what isn't.
I will say, I think she actually, because and I mean, this was the other thing. I mean, there was a point where I'd probably have 2 to 3 drinks a night, completely disappeared, no more like cravings, I think I noticed the same thing with her as well. Where we used to drink wine in the evenings, just gone. There's not that, there was no longer that I need something to kind of soothe the crash. And so that was something I think she did experience.
It's interesting because the question that just raised for me is, because we have these, you know, so-called benign substances, but, call them socially acceptable things like coffee and alcohol and various things. And on the extremes, we know that people are self-medicating with them. But, it makes the question it raises for me is it a much larger group of individuals who are self-medicating in one way or another, and does one lead to another? Like if you are a wine drinker, are you more like, and I'm just picking on wine, it's because it's the example you gave, but if you're a wine drinker, are you more likely to need a morning coffee? And if you're having a morning coffee, are you more likely to want something to wind down at night? I have no idea, but it's an interesting question.
Oh yeah, and I bet, for me it was wine just because cannabis never agreed with me, but I know for a lot of people that's really common. If you're a heavy, stimulant user that smoke a joint in the evening, that's going to be the only time of relief, and then yeah, you do wake up with a little bit of like a weed hangover in the morning, and then that kind of drives that next cycle. Um,
Huh.
yeah. Um, and so, I mean, something that I also think about a lot is, young people in relationships because the, I'm not going to say this is the most important thing, but it is a really important thing for a lot of like young people. It's like connection with others, whether it's friends or whether it's with a romantic partner. And a lot of the times, you know, patients of mine, it's hard to, sometimes the reason they're on the medications is they're lonely. They struggle to find someone, a romantic connection, or to have this kind of friend circle. And then we take these people and we put them on medications which blunt their emotional processing. And, as I've gone through life and kind of looked at myself and my own problems and things like that, and own struggles and relationships and things like that, I can really confidently say that you need to feel things in order to get better in relationships, and you need to kind of have that attunement there to have those, for those problems to come up and to feel it and to feel the pain, and it's also good if your spouse can kind of feel the pain, emotional pain as well, and bring them up, because they're all signs that mean something. And I mean, oftentimes to get a relationship like going, that you really, for a lot of them, you need to have pretty high emotional attunement, because you're you are you, and you have your perspective on the world and the way you were raised and your beliefs and everything. But your spouse is not you. They're very different, and we have this tendency to think that other people are like us, but that's so not true. And so I've always found relationships to be this constant process of like, what do you think about this? Like what does this mean to you? What's important to you? Like, why does this upset you? Why does this not upset you? And I feel like you lose that with medication sometimes when they knock that part out of it, that and then you can really struggle to build that skill set that really does take a while to be able to have a relationship, and a good one, one that's not, the one that's stable and mutually enjoyable, and so yeah, I worry that we're doing a lot of young people a disservice by just whacking them on the medications, and I wonder about the long-term effects it has on their ability to find these stable, enjoyable relationships long term.
I suspect it has much bigger of an effect than anybody is willing to admit. Um, because I think if my husband and I hadn't known each other without the layer of medication, I don't know that we would have connected in the same way. Like it's you know how everybody has like key memories, like things like when your kids are born and that sort of thing, right? And for a long period of time, I had the memory of one of my kids being born and how I had stared at her with wonder, and I tried to memorize like every little pore on her nose and like exactly what her face looked like. Like I wanted to input that memory into my head forever. And I, in my memory, can remember that I felt filled with so much love in that moment. And yet there was a period of years where like I had this memory and I knew how connected I had felt in that moment, but it was a memory versus a current feeling, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
I felt like I was just completely severed from it. Um, and it's taken a long time to like feel. And I guess it's important to kind of differentiate that you can be connected to someone without that live, almost tangible feeling of connection. But it's a lot easier to be connected when you feel the connection. And it took a long time before I was able to feel it again. Um, and I've got all sorts of random, I can't remember if I've told you this before, but I've got like factual memories, and then the factual memories will come up and it's like the emotion never took place. And so this old factual memory will come up, and now all of the emotions will just burst out. Like I'll burst into tears. And it's the first few times it happened, it was kind of a little bit distressing. And then afterwards, I started to kind of understand that it's like, well, so I had this factual knowledge, but my feelings were so disconnected that the feelings didn't take place at the same time. And for a memory to be really authentic, it's both fact and feeling together in the moment. And I can feel those feelings now. So when those memories come up, if I haven't had that moment of feeling, then it's like getting rolled over by a bulldozer. Like it's just an instant flood through my body. But you know, I guess the mercy of it is that you've had time, so it's not a factual surprise.
Hmm.
I kind of understand it now. So when it happens, I'm able to tell myself like, oh, this is what this is, and you know, I'll be okay in 15 minutes or half an hour or whatever.
Wow. I'm just noticing we've just crossed the 1 hour mark, so it may be a good time to wrap. But was there anything else that you wanted to mention before we wrap for today?
I'm curious if you think that everybody is as numbed as what I've experienced it to be. Like, is this something you hear other people talk about?
Um, I don't think so. I'm still of the opinion, when 1 in 10 people in the United States are taking antidepressants, the majority of them being women, I like to think that hopefully a large proportion of those, they've just developed like tolerance to the medication and it's really not having that much of an effect. And their brain is just like used to it and they're just kind of like trucking along and they're still hopefully fairly attuned and all of those things. And it's just sitting there in the background. I mean, I don't really know, honestly. I mean, it's, but I mean, I do think there's probably a lot of people who are like that, especially once you start getting to, several medications at the same time. I think it's just gonna, it's there's gonna be a sufficient amount of like, just modulation going on that it would be pretty numb. But I don't know, it's hard. I mean, you really have to kind of, what will you talk to someone who knows the person? What were they like before? What are they like now? And just kind of see, are they pretty much themselves? Have they changed in any way? But yeah, so I don't know. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, the thing that I realized when you were answering was that the impossible to know side is that you don't truly know until the person is off and outside of the worst of the withdrawal. Because I know that, if you'd asked me a decade ago if I was numb and kind of disconnected, I would have said nope,
No. Yeah.
you know. And it's not something anyone around me had ever pointed out to me.
Oh, if you ask me who was at fault when I was arguing with my wife, when I was on all the stimulants, I'd say, oh, she's so unreasonable, like I would have just blamed it on her. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that self-awareness
Mm.
just in the moment, it's not there. And I think that's the challenge. When I think about the waking up process, how do you how does someone lose that medication spellbinding or whatever you want to call it? Um, I think that's the challenge, right? Because if you can't see the way it's affecting you, how do you make that decision to change it?
Sometimes it's got to be something big because people won't realize the subtle things, but when they have a catastrophic adverse reaction, or like you did, you spent like 3 months in a hospital and 4 weeks, 4 weeks later, you're back in again, and you're just like, what is this? Like, it has to be something so big for some people that it just like blasts through. Like even with the degree of blunting, it's just like there's no, yeah, it's just bad. There's no other way to look at this other than it's bad. I know for some people, and this is really sad because, it can be they develop protracted withdrawal and they're just debilitated. For some people, it's PSSD, and it's just something that's so bad that it totally shatters, you know, um, whatever it is, and then they start looking for answers. But yeah, I mean, I wish there was a way that it didn't have to be this dramatic kind of rock bottom catastrophe that shocks people into looking for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I kind of, admittedly struggle with a little bit in my day-to-day life when someone I know is like, oh yeah, I just got X diagnosis and I'm starting on, whatever psych medication. And it's like, I fundamentally believe in the right to self-determination. And, it's their path. My job isn't to walk someone else's path for them, but it's so difficult when you see the person that is, there's even been cases where, I've made a comment like, just be cautious because if you ever decide that you want to come off of it, don't do it too quickly. And in some cases, you get jumped down of like, oh, don't scare people about withdrawal because then people who need treatment aren't going to get treatment. They'll be too afraid to start. And in my head, I'm like,
Yeah, no, I feel like slapping that person in the face because I used to hear a lot of the same things, and it's this whole thing of like, okay, so you're not allowed to say something to caution them about the medication, but then they're not making like an informed decision, you know, because let's say you say something scary about the drug. Oh, hey, did you know that the risk of suicide was higher in people who are under age 25? Oh, no, 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 don't say that. That's going to scare them away from taking the drug. Um, it should, because
right.
it should weigh, like if it's true, it should weigh on the decision for someone to take it. And they have to weigh it in their own minds with the risks and the benefits in their own individual situation. And that's the thing. So whenever because it's like this threat, you're going to be dangerous and they're going to get hurt because of you. And it's like, well, I could get hurt if I don't say this. And yeah, anyway, that's
Yeah.
one of the things that
Yeah.
just kind of bothers me a lot as well.
Yeah, and it's so hard. I was saying to my mom just this last week how I've been watching a lot of women my age getting ADHD diagnoses lately and starting on ADHD meds. And in the process of my comments, I found out that a relative, actually a few relatives are on them, and I was cautioned to be careful where I made those statements and around who. But and it's I
Isn't that
struggle
isn't
with
that
the
crazy though? It's just like we've been scared to a point where it's like you don't say that, it's really you're going to say some dangerous thing that's going to really either upset someone or, harm them in some way. It's
yeah, and it's like, there was a time when I believed that the medications I was on was what was allowing me to live my life. Like I've had that belief, and there's only one thing I can say to my past self, and it's that I was wrong.
Mhm.
It was a completely incorrect belief because I have a better life now. Like in terms of how I feel day to day and how I cope with different things that come my way. And, for a period of time, I was on disability because I couldn't handle schedules. Like I simply having something on my calendar was too much. So I avoided making commitments because I just couldn't handle that. And now, you know, I'm a full-time student and I work full-time and I've got this big list of things and people, look at it and they're like, how do you handle it? And I'm like, well, I just, do this here and this here. And it doesn't like, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would do all of this, I would say, no, you don't know me. There's no way I would ever be capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And I would have, been completely wrong. But it's it's fundamentally, I feel like me now, uh, and it actually feels really good to say that because the number of times that I legitimately asked my psychiatrist, how do people who've had amnesia, how do they cope? How do they, adjust to their lives? Because I felt like I was waking up from amnesia. And, I never got a really concise answer to that, but that's how profound this has been for me. It's like coming out of a coma and here you are and here's this life and what do you do next?
Yeah. The story about hearing about other people on the medications. I mean, my story. I think I told you, I was in a Verizon store the other day, and I was being served by the kindest, young gentleman, and then he saw that my business name was Witt-Doerring Psychiatric Consulting, and then he went on to tell me he was on like 5 different medications, antipsychotics, stimulants, downers, everything like that, and it's like I'm also in the same place where I feel like I know so much, and I knew enough to know that something really bad was happening. Like okay, sometimes you can be on a combination of drugs, and it's this careful balance, and it's really thought out. But the majority of time, when you're taking antipsychotics and you're also on Adderall, like something is really wrong because they're either over sedated and now they're getting stimulants to get them up. And I was just thinking like life must be hard for this guy, and it really, like, I mean, I left the store with a pit in my stomach. I'm not going to say anything or like, but it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, and it's just that feeling of like powerlessness, and I'm just like, this has a bad trajectory, and I'm just like, is he going to wake up? It like how many years will be lost? And I see that just every day, and in different, not like, but like in a lot of my work, and I've seen it before, and it's just so deeply, I don't know, it hurts me, I have to say. Yeah. So
Yeah, and it's, I think back and, if I'm really candid, if I say, is there anything anybody could have said to change my mind before I was ready? I don't think so.
yeah,
I, I, I think in a lot of ways, I think that I had to discover it for myself. Um, and I didn't have anybody around me saying, like, hey, we think you should do this or any of that. Like, I didn't have any external input. Um, but I believed so wholeheartedly that this was the diagnosis, this was the correct action, that anybody who would have challenged that, I would have either gotten mad or I would have shut them out of my life. I wouldn't have. The only person who could have challenged it, there's only one person, my psychiatrist was the only one who could have said, hey, because that was actually why I ended up never on SSRIs again. I had a doctor who said, I think these are making you cycle more rapidly. And so, you should never take an SSRI again. And I did accept that. So I think had I had a doctor that had said, you're really over medicated and I'm not sure that you even need anything, I probably would have accepted that and been willing to try. But I think that's the only alternate path where I would have been willing to hear it because I wouldn't have heard it from like my husband or my mom or a friend.
And I think psychiatric medications, and I think this can happen with other meds, but especially with the psychiatric ones, the, I mean, the taking of them is so, I don't know, it's like this foundation in a house. It's like like, it helps you make sense of the problems that you have, and sometimes even shields them for it. It's like it's not your fault. The things that have happened. You're addressing them. You're responsible. You're doing the right thing to address your problems. There can be so much tied up in there, which makes it really, I mean, even more so difficult to have those conversations with people because it's just, I don't know, it can bring down the whole house. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's so much um, there's so much of society built around it at this point. And it's interesting, this is just a random tidbit of something I discovered about myself, in the last, I guess, month and a half, that I I don't think badly of anybody else who's a psych patient, but I apparently have a whole lot of self-loathing towards myself about the idea of being seen that way. So I've kind of taken on some sort of, I don't know whether it's a stereotype or I'm not sure what the right word is for it, but it's like I've rejected that label so completely that I almost feel like disgust for it, if that makes sense. And so along with that has also come a fear of someone trying to push the label back onto me again. And it's a very, it's kind of weird to me. I haven't completely wrapped my head around it, but
I mean, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thought. I mean, the thought that popped up in my mind when you were saying that is you know, I guess being a psychiatric patient is obviously, can clearly be synonymous with taking medications, the label, the drugs are the solution. And so it's a disempowered position. Whereas kind of once you reject that, there's more autonomy, there's more empowerment, the locus of control is for me. So at least from that perspective, I could see why you could have a really, really strong reaction to that feeling of powerlessness that you had then, almost a disgust reaction. I don't know if that's kind of some of the things rattling around there. That's what I imagine I might feel, but maybe it's more complex for you.
yeah, that's definitely a big part of it because, I had both good care and bad care when I was an inpatient. And, you spend enough time as an inpatient and you're going to have negative experiences. And I've had some experiences that were very disempowering and very, like, they felt violating of my rights when they occurred. Uh, and so I think there's almost this internalization that when society views you as someone who's had any kind of psychiatric problem, that you lose a level of trust almost. Like your opinion is more likely to be written off as, craziness or whatever kind of derogatory word you might put with it. And I think that's kind of the root of it is once you are like, I know I'm okay. Like I know I don't have anything wrong with me at this point, aside from working through the rest of the trauma pieces. Um, and so there's this huge fear of the power differential. That you know what if and it's probably just honestly partly more trauma that
But it could
needs
be
to be
real,
worked
right?
through.
Like what if you go to the hospital with a rare medical condition and they see that you had a bipolar diagnosis in the past? What happens
Yes.
then? Are they going to take
Yeah.
me less seriously? Are they going to write me off? I mean, that seems
Yeah.
real to me.
And I actually, and it hasn't happened yet, but I've actually asked for my doctor to remove the bipolar from my medical record. And it's very tricky waters. Um, so like that's a really big request because it's almost like there's a fear of removing it, even though like he's verbally said that he thinks it was a misdiagnosis. But there's also a there's also this like, well, it's only been a few years, so like who knows what'll happen in another few more years sort of feeling.
Yeah. Well, it's always interesting to talk to you. I do have to I do have to stop this now. I'm gonna go carry on. So I'm gonna stop the recording, but just want to say once more, I love talking to you. I find your insights just great, and I'm sure I'm gonna be talking to you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on and for the conversation. I always enjoy it as well.
Yeah.